All right, strap in, everybody. Today we're diving headfirst into the world of goblins.
A classic.
Definitely a fan favorite, but they can be a bit confusing. I mean, are they little pranksters or like terrifying monsters? Where do they even come from?
Well, that's what makes this deep dive so interesting, really.
Totally. And we've got a ton of material to sift through, folklore articles, personal accounts, even cracking open some D&D rulebooks. So, ready to get started?
Let's do it.
Okay, so first things first, let's talk about the origins of goblins. Where did these creatures come from?
Well, even the word goblin is kind of a mystery.
Oh.
It probably comes from Old French, goblin, but there's hints of German, Greek, even Latin roots in there too. Almost like they're trying to hide their true ancestry.
Yeah, sneaky goblins. Well, some of the earliest goblin stories that we've got come from British and Germanic folklore, right?
Yeah, and back then they were seen as more of a household nuisance than a true monster.
Yeah, more mischievous than evil.
Exactly. Think the original poltergeist. Causing little annoyances, playing pranks, maybe swiping a sock or two.
Okay, so not exactly the stuff of nightmares, but that's a far cry from, the goblins we see in movies and video games today, right? Those guys are straight up terrifying. What happened?
Well, there were some key moments that kind of shifted how we see goblins. There's this Dutch fable called The Goblins Turned to Stone.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it plays on this old belief that sunlight would literally turn goblins to stone.
Whoa. So they're like what? Creatures of darkness? Almost like vampires or something?
Yeah, there was definitely that fear of goblins in early folklore, that sense that they were dangerous. But things really started to change, I think, with the rise of modern fantasy.
Oh, you mean like Tolkien?
Tolkien for sure, but even before him, there was George MacDonald. He wrote The Princess and the Goblin.
Wait, George MacDonald, the children's book author.
Yeah, that's him.
Mm-hmm.
But his 1871 novel was super influential. It shaped how we see goblins today. His goblins were complex, not just mischievous, but sometimes even, kind of sympathetic.
Interesting. And this is where Tolkien comes in.
Exactly. MacDonald's work was a huge influence on Tolkien.
Okay, now it's making sense. Tolkien's goblins, especially in The Hobbit, are way more menacing. Stony voices, frog-like features. Yeah, not the cute little garden gnome type.
No, Tolkien's goblins were large, ugly, and just inherently evil. A big shift from the mischievous tricksters of the past. And they had some pretty disturbing habits, too.
Oh, like what?
Well, according to Tolkien, they had a taste for horses, ponies, and donkeys.
Yikes.
Tolkien also described them as skilled miners and creators of, let's just say, not-so-nice tools, torture devices, weapons, and even suggested they could make modern killing machines.
Wow, dark stuff. But Tolkien used the term orc a lot, too, right? Are those the same thing as goblins?
He did use the terms kind of interchangeably, but generally it seemed like he preferred orc for the bigger, more brutal types. In The Lord of the Rings, orc kind of became the go-to term, pushing the traditional goblin more into the shadows.
Gotcha. So Tolkien gives us this darker, scarier goblin, but then we've also got that classic image, right? The little green guy.
Right, and that's where Dungeons and Dragons comes in.
Ah, of course, D&D. They took a page from Tolkien, but their goblins are definitely closer to that little green guy image. Still, they've got a dark side too. Those D&D rulebooks lay out some pretty wild details about goblin society, like their love of torture and that whole chaotic nature thing they've got going on.
It's like they took all those bits and pieces from folklore and just turned it into this playable race. The monster manual especially, it really fleshes out the modern goblin, from their tribal society and hatred of sunlight to their lifespan, around 50 years apparently.
So much detail. Do you think most people really care about the specifics of goblin anatomy or their social structure?
Maybe not everyone, but D&D is interesting, right? It gives you this really specific framework for goblins, but then it also lets players interpret them in different ways. I think that reflects something really interesting about how we see goblins as a whole. Are they something to fear or something to laugh at?
Yeah, that's a good point. So even within D&D, we've got this ambivalence about goblins. Speaking of ambivalence, we got to talk about one depiction that I know caused a lot of controversy. The goblins in Harry Potter.
Oh yeah. The Gringotts goblins.
Yeah.
That one definitely raised some eyebrows.
Putting aside the controversy, it shows how even fictional creatures can be connected to real-world stuff. It's a good reminder to, think about what we're putting out there, even when we're dealing with fantasy.
Absolutely. And it ties back to that age-old connection of goblins with greed. their love of shiny things. There's even a political cartoon from like 1913 that depicts a corporate overlord as a goblin.
So this image of the greedy goblin has been around for a while. But let's get to the question that I know everyone wants answered. Are goblins real? Like, have there been any actual documented encounters with these creatures?
Well, now things get really interesting. We dug up some sources that claim to document real-world goblin sightings.
Whoa, hold up. Really?
Yeah, now, we got to be skeptical, of course, but some of them are pretty compelling.
Okay, I am officially hooked. Tell me more about these sightings.
One author shared a personal story about encountering a goblin-like creature while driving late at night. They described it as small, greenish-gray, and get this, incredibly agile. They even said it leaped over their moving car.
Wait a minute, leaping over a car. That's either one tall tale or a car. We're talking about some seriously athletic goblins. What else did you find?
One of the most well-known is the Goblins of Hopkinsville incident. Back in 1955, a group of people in Kentucky claimed they were attacked by goblins at their farmhouse. They even said they were fighting them off with gunfire.
A goblin shootout.
The police investigated, but they couldn't find any evidence of goblins, just bullet holes in the farmhouse. Later, some people said the whole thing was just, a combination of alcohol, a meteor shower, and maybe some owls they mistook for goblins.
Oh, so glowing eyes in the dark could have been owls. But what about that goblin scarecrow of the Pennsylvania wilds? That one sounds creepy.
The goblin scarecrow, yeah, that one's a bit more questionable in terms of its goblin status.
How so?
Well, they say it's got a jack-o'-lantern for a head and stands at human height. Not exactly your typical goblin, right?
True. That does sound more like a Halloween prank than a real goblin. But you know what I don't get? We saw this heat map of goblin sightings in the US, and it's weird. Tons in the South, but almost none in some states, like Indiana and Massachusetts. What's with that?
Yeah, that is strange. Makes you wonder if it has to do with local beliefs or environmental factors, or maybe something we haven't even thought of.
This whole goblin mystery is deeper than I thought. We've got centuries of folklore, all these different interpretations, and then these tantalizing hints that maybe, just maybe, they're real. It's like they're intentionally staying hidden, just out of reach.
And yet, they continue to fascinate us. They're like these little whispers in the back of our minds, reminding us that not everything can be explained by logic and reason.
Which brings us to this fascinating twist. One of our sources suggested that maybe we've been looking for goblins in the wrong places all along.
What do you mean? We shouldn't be checking caves and forests?
Maybe not. This source argued that goblins might not be creatures of flesh and blood at all. What if they exist on a different plane of reality, one that we can only see through altered states of consciousness?
Hold on, we're talking about, psychedelics.
That's exactly what this source suggests. They claim to have encountered goblins through using, entheogens, things like magic mushrooms and ayahuasca, and what they found wasn't exactly what you'd expect.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these psychedelic goblins.
Well, they said you couldn't really see them clearly. It was more like a felt presence. They were mischievous, hiding things, playing pranks.
So even in this other reality, goblins are still up to their old tricks.
Seems like it. Now, obviously, we have to acknowledge that these are subjective experiences, but it raises some interesting questions, right? Could it be that these ancient stories, these common threads across cultures, are actually based on some kind of shared ancient experience, maybe one that came from these altered states of consciousness?
It's a really thought-provoking idea, like these creatures are tapping into something deep within the human psyche, something that goes beyond cultural boundaries, and maybe even the limitations of our physical world.
Are we saying that goblins are more like archetypes, thought forms, instead of actual creatures? I'm not sure I'm ready to go there.
I get it, it's a big jump.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that folklore and mythology don't always play by the rules of logic and reason, right? They operate on a different level, one that speaks to our intuition and imagination.
Like those old sayings, there are more things in heaven and earth.
Exactly. And maybe goblins, in all their different forms, are a reminder of that very truth.
I like that. So we've covered a lot of ground. The origins of goblins, the different ways they've been portrayed, and even the possibility that they exist in some form somewhere out there. But now I'm curious, what about you? What's standing out to you the most from all this?
You know what really strikes me is just how enduring the goblin myth is. It's survived for centuries, changing and adapting right alongside human culture. Even today, in our super tech-focused world, goblins still capture our imaginations. It's like they refuse to be forgotten.
Like these persistent little tricksters, always right there on the edge of our awareness.
Yeah, and that persistence has to mean something. They represent something primal, something that speaks to the deepest parts of ourselves.
So you're saying goblins are more than just fictional creatures,
Right.
that they actually serve some kind of purpose.
It's a question worth thinking about, isn't it? I think the answer might be different for everyone. But I do believe that goblins, in all their forms, offers a glimpse into the unknown. They're a reminder that there's always more to discover, both within ourselves and in the world around us.
That's a beautiful thought. It's like they're inviting us to embrace the mystery, to explore those hidden corners of our minds and the world beyond our senses.
Exactly. And just maybe if we do that, we'll discover a little bit of magic along the way.
Okay, so goblins are mischievous, maybe a little chaotic, and possibly lurking in the shadows of our minds. But they also seem to be pointing us towards something deeper, something that goes beyond the limits of our everyday world. They're like these unlikely guides, leading us on a journey into the unknown.
And like any journey into the unknown, it's best to proceed with both caution and a sense of wonder.
Well said. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive into the world of goblins, I've got one more question. We talked about all these different portrayals, right? The tricksters from folklore, the monsters in Tolkien, even those unsettling goblins from Harry Potter. But what about that source that mentioned those real goblin encounters, the ones people had with psychedelics? They described the goblins as almost childlike, playful even. How do those fit into the bigger picture?
Ah, that's a great point. It shows just how many different ways there are to interpret these creatures. Maybe those childlike, playful goblins represent a more like primal, innocent aspect of the archetype.
Like they're connected to something deeper within us, something untouched by all the complexities of, the modern world.
It's definitely a possibility. And it reminds us that even in the realm of the unknown, there's room for joy, laughter, even a sense of wonder.
It's like they're telling us not to take ourselves too seriously, to, embrace the absurdity of it all, even when we're dealing with the shadows.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, that's the key to unlocking the true mystery of the goblins.
All right, we've explored the history, the myths, even the possibility that they exist in some form. But you came to us wanting to understand what goblins mean, right? And to do that, we need to shift gears a little bit. We need to talk about you.
What is it about goblins that fascinates you? What questions are swirling around in your mind right now?
We won't put you on the spot or anything, but think about those questions as we move into the next part of this deep dive, because the answers might surprise you. Thinking about those psychedelic goblins, it makes me wonder if maybe we've become too rational, like we're so quick to dismiss anything that can't be explained by science.
That's a good point. We live in a world obsessed with logic and proof, but maybe we've lost something along the way. That openness to the unexplained.
Exactly. Think about those real-world goblin sightings we talked about. Even if we're, totally skeptical, they still tap into something primal, right? That need to believe in something beyond the ordinary.
It's like those stories, whether they're true or not, are like cracks in the pavement of our everyday reality. A little reminder that there might be more out there, just beyond our perception.
And that brings us back to those childlike goblins, the ones people saw during altered states. What if those goblins represent that lost sense of wonder, that primal connection to something bigger than ourselves?
It's a fascinating idea. Maybe those playful goblins are a part of us, the part that's not weighed down by logic and expectations, the part that remembers how to see magic in the everyday.
Maybe that's why goblins still hold such a grip on our imaginations. Even in this age of technology and information overload, they remind us that there are still mysteries out there, things science can't explain.
And that brings us back to you, the listener. What is it about goblins that speaks to you? Are you drawn to their mischief, their connection to the wild, or something else entirely?
We've talked about how goblins have been portrayed in so many ways. Pranksters, monsters, even bankers. But is there a common thread? What is it about these creatures that keeps us coming back for more?
Some people believe that goblins represent our fear of the unknown. They embody the darkness that lurks at the edge of our awareness, the things that go bump in the night.
I can definitely see that. They're the embodiment of all our anxieties about what might be hiding in the shadows.
But I think it goes deeper than just fear. Goblins also represent a certain wildness, a chaotic energy that we find unsettling, but also strangely alluring.
It's funny. I used to think goblins were kind of silly, just these little green guys causing trouble. But all this research for the deep dive has really changed my perspective.
Oh, how so?
Well, I had this dream a while back. It wasn't exactly a nightmare, but it was definitely unsettling. I was in this dark, damp cave, and I could hear all these sounds, like scratching and chittering.
Creepy.
It was. And then I saw them, these small, shadowy figures just darting around the edges of my vision. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew, like, instinctively that they were goblins.
And how did that make you feel?
Honestly, a little afraid, but also curious. Like, I wanted to know more about them, to understand why they were in my dream.
It's like they were inviting you to explore a part of yourself that you hadn't really acknowledged before. The part that's okay with darkness, with the unknown.
Maybe you're right. And maybe that's part of the reason we're so drawn to goblins. They make us confront those shadowy parts of ourselves. The parts we might be afraid to admit are there.
And in doing so, they give us a chance to grow, to expand our understanding of what it means to be human.
So we've talked about goblins as symbols of our fears, our wildness, even our shadow selves. But there's another interpretation we haven't touched on yet. Goblins as tricksters.
Ah, yes. The mischievous pranksters. The ones who love chaos and disruption.
Exactly. Like that friend who loves to play practical jokes. The one who always keeps you on your toes.
And even though their pranks can be annoying, sometimes even harmful, there's still that playfulness to them. A sense of humor that can be kind of infectious.
Like they're reminding us not to take life too seriously, to embrace the absurdity of it all.
And that's an important lesson, isn't it? In a world that often feels too structured and controlled, goblins remind us to loosen up, to allow for a bit of chaos and spontaneity.
So maybe goblins aren't trying to scare us or hurt us. Maybe they're just trying to shake things up a bit, get us to see the world from a different angle.
It's a thought-provoking idea. And it makes me wonder, in trying to understand goblins, are we actually trying to understand ourselves?
The part of us that wants a little mischief, a little magic, a little unexpectedness.
And goblins are definitely unexpected. They defy all our attempts to categorize and define them, always slipping through our fingers just when we think we've got them figured out.
Which brings us to the final and maybe most important question. What do goblins ultimately mean to you, the listener?
We've explored their history, their mythology, their potential existence in the physical and, well, the metaphysical realms. But the true meaning of the goblin, how it resonates with you, that's something only you can discover.
Think about all the different interpretations we've discussed. Fear of the unknown, embracing wildness, the playful trickster, the shadow self. Which of these speaks to you the most?
Or maybe you have a completely different interpretation, one that's unique to your own experiences and perspectives.
Because ultimately, the power of the goblin lies in its ability to spark our imaginations, to make us question our assumptions, and to remind us that there's still magic to be found in the world, even in the most unexpected places.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, we encourage you to keep exploring the world of goblins. Delve deeper into the myths and legends. Listen to those whispers in the back of your mind.
Because the answers you're looking for might be closer than you think, hidden just beyond the veil of the everyday.
And who knows, maybe in searching for goblins, you'll discover something even more extraordinary, a deeper understanding of yourself.
And that, my friend, is the true magic of the deep dive. Okay, so we've really gone deep on goblin lore. We've seen how they've gone from like little mischief makers to these full-blown monsters, and we even talked about the possibility that they exist on like a whole other plane of reality.
And we've seen goblins as pranksters, as monsters, even as bankers. But now we get to the really interesting part, figuring out what they mean to you, the listener.
Right. We could spend hours just listing off goblin traits and, what they do in different stories, but that wouldn't really get at why you find them fascinating.
So let's zoom out a bit. We've seen how goblins are kind of reflected in our fears and our fascination with the wild, even in those unsettling encounters that we talked about.
Yeah, those eyewitness accounts, even if we're skeptical, I think they tap into something deeper. Is it like a need to believe in magic, or maybe like a yearning for a world that's more than just, facts and figures?
Maybe both. Think about those childlike goblins that people reported seeing during altered states of consciousness.
Yeah.
Could those represent a part of us that's been, I don't know, kind of stifled by the modern world? Like that sense of wonder we had as kids before, logic took over?
I'll admit, when we first started talking about the whole psychedelic goblin thing, I was pretty skeptical.
Yeah, it's definitely out there.
But it got me thinking, What if our need to explain everything has actually closed us off to, to possibilities?
It's like we've built these walls around our perception, and we only let in the things that we can neatly categorize and explain. But goblins, I mean, by their very nature, they defy categorization.
Right. They're messy, they're contradictory, they're always like lurking just outside the edges of what we think we know.
Exactly. And maybe that's their purpose.
Yeah.
To remind us that there's more to reality than what we can see and touch and measure.
That there are mysteries out there that we haven't even begun to like wrap our heads around, forces that we can't control, only like, glimpse.
And instead of trying to contain those mysteries, maybe we should try to embrace them.
Allow ourselves to be a little unsettled, to be okay with not knowing all the answers.
Because maybe in that discomfort and letting go of certainty, maybe that's where we find the real magic.
Maybe goblins aren't about finding a real creature out there in the woods. Maybe they're about recognizing the limits of our own perception.
Recognizing that reality is so much bigger and stranger and more wonderful than we often give it credit for.
So as you continue on your own explorations, think about what we've talked about today. Keep an open mind, embrace the unexpected, and, never lose that sense of childlike wonder.
Because goblins, in all their forms, they're more than just creatures of myth and legend. They're reflections of ourselves, whispers from the unknown, inviting us to step outside the boundaries of the ordinary and embrace the magic that's waiting just beyond.
And that, my friend, is the real treasure at the end of this deep dive. Understanding that the world is full of mystery and that the most amazing discoveries are often the ones that we make within ourselves.